So today, I'm going to share with you a portion of my testimony. It's really a journey of faith and reason. I spent about 10 years before coming down to Pensacola in academic and research settings. Approximately half that time was spent in our Adventist institutions, Southern Adventist University. And the other half was spent getting a PhD at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. It's a great learning institution, but also the environment where evolution finds its foundations in academic research. So Pastor spoke earlier this month on belief in theistic evolution and how a belief in theistic evolution undermines a biblical belief in Christ and in God. And as I heard his sermon, I heard a portion of my testimony in it. And he really approached it from a theological basis. And so I want to just recap briefly what he talked about, and then approach it from another perspective today. The concept that I really held on to in my journey of faith was the concept that if God is good, how could he use death as his engine of creation, right? So Pastor talked some about this. And what does this mean? How can we unpack this? So evolutionary theory states wherever you put God, whether you put him at the very beginning or anywhere in between, that new species are created through natural selection, right? So what is natural selection? This is the continued existence of organisms which are best adapted to their environment with the extinction of others. Essentially, this is the strong survive and the weak die, right? And so this process is what generates new species under the assumption of the evolutionary theory, right? And so if God is using this process to create, that would mean that God uses death to create. And in my journey through life, I held on to that I know God is a good God, right? And so this is Pastor's slide. This is some of the foundation of what he talked about. If we adhere to an evolutionary worldview, then we lose the character of God, right? We lose the reliability of his word. Going into Matthew 19. So he said to him, this is Jesus speaking, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, and that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments." Again here in 3 John, "Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. He who does good is of God, but he who does evil has not seen God." And so if I profess to believe that evolution is the driver of God's creation, then I can throw these concepts out the window. And then follows the rest of what Pastor talked about, the plan of salvation, the great controversy, right? The Sabbath, the second coming of Jesus, his ministry for us, the three angels' message, even our ability to enter into relationship with God is just absolutely destroyed. So today, I'd like to have a conversation with you about faith. I'd like to share a portion of my testimony and how God has led me on a journey of faith and reason. From our Adventist institutions to the institutions of this world, I'd like to share with you about my struggle between creation and evolution. And I'd like to share a portion of my testimony as how God has led me on a journey of faith and reason. So there's a number of types of people here in this room today. There is someone who walked through that door who believes that the creation account in the Bible is a myth and adheres to the theory of evolution. And today I want to have a conversation with you. I've been in your shoes. I know where you're at, and I'd like to talk to you. There's another type of person in this room. When Pastor Brian Denise came and preached his sermon, he had a beautiful prayer, and in it he said, "Jesus, there's part of me that loves you and wants to grow closer and closer with you. And there's a part of me that hates you and is at enmity with you. Help the part of me that loves you to grow, and help the part of me that hates you to shrink." And very similarly, there's someone in this room, I identify this as well, that believes that God is my creator. But there's a portion of me, maybe I hear a podcast from an epidemiology expert that I trust through COVID, let's say, and he shares something about something from an evolutionary world perspective, and it casts a seed of doubt in my mind. Or maybe a YouTube video that you hear someone that you trust, someone that you respect, a thought leader who shares something that comes from an evolutionary worldview, and it gives you pause. To that person in this room, I'd also like to have a conversation with you. And to the person in this room who came through those doors and has 100% faith that God is their creator, I hope that as we speak, we might add faith unto faith and pray in your heart that the words of my mouth will come from God and that our hearts and our ears might be opened. So with that, let's cover a brief outline. First, I want to have a conversation about faith. And then after that, we're going to switch gears. And I know summer just started, but we're going to put our student caps on for a second and talk about molecular biology. What even is molecular biology? Don't worry, we'll take it easy on you. So we'll use a couple analogies to better understand the cell, is what we're going to study. Then we're going to bring it back to faith through something called the orthology argument, and we'll get into that. So let's begin. So I need a little help here. I'm more of a lecturer than a preacher. So, here we go. Excuse me. So before we get into that, faith. So the world's theology is self-oriented, right? Trust yourself, be self-confident, stay true to yourself, build your self-esteem. Today's Sabbath school lesson was even talking about this. The world's perspective, what the world says. Use your senses to figure out what is good and what is right. This is where moral relativism comes from. You have it in your own mind to determine what is right and wrong. Now, the biblical theology is completely opposed to this. We are not called to be of this world. The biblical theology rests on faith, a faith in God. Very simply put, Romans 1. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith, not the just shall live by self. And once again, Paul talking to the Corinthians, for we walk by faith, not by sight. So we know faith is important, but what is faith? How do we live by faith, right? So faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Okay, so faith is the substance of things hoped for. Now, what does this mean? So the word substance here, depending on your translation, if you're in the ESV, another word that it uses is assurance or assurity, all right? And the root word here in the Greek is hypostasis. So if we break this word down, the hypostasis of things hoped for. Hypo meaning under, and stasis meaning static. So below static, something like a foundation, right? So faith is the foundation of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And truly in the common Greek, this word substance or hypostasis, it meant a title. And in this case, it means a title, like a certificate of title, like the title for your home, or a title for a piece of property, or for a vehicle, right? So faith is the title of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So, Dylan, I've got a analogy to kind of understand faith with you here. So, Dylan, tell me, do you hope one day to live on acreage, on a piece of property?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Do you and your wife dream about it? Like, what are some of the things you dream about on this property?
Growing blueberries.
Growing blueberries, a big old patch of blueberries, right? So Dylan has a hope for the future, right? And how many acres would you say you'd want to live on sometime in the future?
20 would be great, 100 better.
20 great, 100 better, right? And I know I was talking to Manny yesterday. I know there's some other people in this room who resonate with that hope and the dream. So if you look here, what does this say?
Certificate of title.
So this is a certificate of title. Dylan, I have your faith in my hands. This is a title for the things hoped for. What if I told you this is a title for 80 acres of ground in Alabama?
I'd say take care of it.
So Dylan's not going to have any faith in me after this, because this is indeed not a title for 80 acres. But this is what faith gives us access to. It gives us access to the title of things hoped for. Okay, so that's what faith is. So I'd like to share a story with you. The story goes of a man, he was a miner during the gold rush in the mid-1800s. It was 1849, and he had traveled to stake his claim in the mountains of California. So he got to his claim, and he is trying to determine whether he struck it rich. So he collects some ore, and to determine whether it was good ore or not, he has to get it assayed. And the assayers lived down the mountain, across the desert, on the coast in Los Angeles. So to determine whether he struck it rich or not, he packs up his ore, packs up his provisions, water, food, and starts to head across the desert. This, if you know the region in California, this is the area where Death Valley is, right? So he begins his trek across the desert, and somehow he gets his X's and O's crossed, gets turned around, and gets lost. And so he's out in the desert, his provisions are running dry, he runs out of water, and he recognizes that he's close to the end. He starts to see visions in the mirages and realizes what's coming on. And there's a rocky outcropping, and he thinks he sees a cabin off in the distance. And it may just be his visions playing tricks on him, but he decides to head off to it, and sure enough, a cabin appears. And so he knocks on the door of the cabin, no one answers, so he lets himself in, and he sees in the corner that there is this well and a pump coming up out of the ground, and he thinks to himself, oh, thank God I'm saved. And so he runs over, he falls down at the pump, and he starts pumping and pumping and pumping, and he can feel there's no pressure, there's no water getting pumped up from the well. And in desperation, he just keeps pumping and pumping and pumping until he falls down in exhaustion, realizing his end is going to come. And as he's laying on the ground, he looks in the other corner of the cabin, and he sees this jar of water. So he runs over to the jar of water, and he picks it up, and he's just about to start drinking it, but then he sees there's a note on this jar of water, and it says, please use this water to start the pump. It works. After you are done, do not forget to refill the bottle again. So he's at a little bit of a dilemma. He's just about to die from thirst. He's got water in his hands, or does he have faith in the note? Does he have faith in the pump that if he takes the jar and pours it down the pump, that it's actually going to do what it says? And if you know anything about hand pumps, they need to be primed, right? So after struggling in his mind, he decides to have faith. Faith in the note, faith in the pump. It's old, does it even work? He opens up the lid, pours in the water, and starts pumping. And sure enough, he can feel the resistance, and he can feel that water being pulled up out of the ground. And as he's pumping, cool, clear, crisp water comes pouring out. More than enough to fill his canteens, to fill his belly, to refill the jar for the next person. The world tells us, live by sight. You can see it, you can see the jar, you can taste it, you can touch it, you can drink it. Just go with the jar. We are told to live a different way. We're told to live by faith. We are told to have faith that when we have access to the source, when we have access to the fountain, that we can pump enough water for us, enough to fill our canteens, enough to be filled and overflowed, and enough to fill the whole world. So that is what we are called into. So, I'm going to switch gears here really quickly. and have a conversation about molecular biology. Okay, so what even is molecular biology? I need a little bit of interaction here. So by show of hands, how long has it been since you've been in a biology class? So if it's been 20 years, 22 years, put 2 fingers in the air. If it's been 40 years, put 4 in the air. If you've never been in a biology class, you can just hold up both hands. Okay, good. Good. Here we go. So we're going to learn today a little bit about the human cell, okay? So does anybody know what this structure is right here? You're not allowed to answer anymore. All right, so this is the nucleus, okay? Does anybody know what important piece of information this nucleus holds? Help me here. DNA. Okay, so we've all heard of DNA, right? So DNA is held in the nucleus. Okay, how about this structure right here? What was that? Okay, we got mitochondria over here. Manny, can you turn the lights down for a second? Good. We're going to do a couple harder ones. Does anybody know what this structure is? Man, I hear a lot of sounds out there. So this is the Golgi Apparatus. Good. So as we talk today, what I want to do with you is build an understanding of the cell. And to do that, we are going to work an analogy together. We are going to think about the cell as a city. Okay? So if you were a civil engineer, a city planner, what are some important pieces of infrastructure that are necessary in your city? Help me out here. Throw them out. Traffic. Okay, so a road infrastructure is important for your city. Excellent. All right. What else? Electricity. So you need a power plant and an electrical grid. Good. Water. Good. So we need utilities. Excellent. What else? Government. Okay, so you need a leadership structure, right? Some central planning over here. Waste disposal. Excellent. Teeing me up, Victoria. I see you. All right. Anyone else? Over here? Okay, fire department and police. Excellent. All right, good. So turns out in the cell, we have an incredible amount of analogous structures that we can think of as a city, okay? So a little bit of terminology here. In the human body, we have organs. In the cell, we have organelles. So each of these individual little structures are organelles, okay? So central planning, right? Government infrastructure. So the central planning location of the cell is the nucleus. This is where the DNA is held, information, right? So that's the nucleus. Okay, manufacturing plants. Think Detroit, right? A lot of cities have some service or product that they are making. So the manufacturing plant of the cell, it's very hard to see, but there's small structures here called ribosomes. Okay, so that the cell has a manufacturing plant. Okay, also has our electrical infrastructure, right? A power plant. We've got the Christ natural gas power plant sitting right back here on the river, right? So the power plant of the cell is the mitochondria, right? So we'll get a couple more. We need some sort of delivery system, right? Think UPS, FedEx, the USPS. So same thing in the cell. We've got the Golgi apparatus, which can direct material around the cell, correct? Good. So waste management, all right? The cell also has a waste management system in the lysosomes, okay, to clean out trash, right? So one last one, our road infrastructure, right? Manage traffic. There is a road and infrastructure network called the cytoskeleton. Skeleton, it has a skeletal function as well. So we're starting to understand that a cell is a complex system, as complex as a city, potentially. So to begin to delve into the complexity of a cell, I want to look at a couple of these different structures, these organelles, together today, okay? So the first one that I want to look at is the cytoskeleton, okay? This is a cytoskeleton road network, so we can think of this as our transportation network. It also has the word skeleton in it, so it has a skeletal function. It provides structure, okay? So if we look at this graphical representation here, all of these little pink lines is the cytoskeleton. It performs an actual like skeletal structure. It allows the shape of the cell. It can hold the organelles, right? And this is a graphical description of the road network in a cell actually functioning, okay? So don't worry about the names here, but this is a kinesin motor protein that can physically walk along our road network and transport material through the cell, okay? So as we talk together, I want to begin to develop an idea in your mind of how complex the cell is. So this is one single protein that literally has the same complexity as your car. It is as complex as a car, as your refrigerator. It has moving parts. It has direction. It can take signals, okay? And so in the cytoskeleton network, there are literally hundreds of unique proteins. And inside the entire cytoskeleton network in a cell, it is comprised of millions of individual proteins. So it's a highly complex system, okay? So let's talk about another one here. This is the nucleus, and help me here. What does the nucleus store? DNA, good, so information storage. And we know DNA is a sensitive and important structure, right? So you could imagine that this is a closely guarded environment, right? So around the nucleus, there's something called a nuclear envelope, right? That surrounds and protects the nucleus. And in the nuclear envelope, there are nuclear pores, little holes in the nucleus. And these pores are regulated by a nuclear pore complex. One of the ways that we can think of this is like a TSA check gate. You know, you go through TSA and they've got a millimeter wave scanner, they've got an X-ray scanner that can identify metal, can identify ceramics. It can identify whether you have 2 ounces of fluid in your bag, right? And so as sensitive as a TSA check gate is, the nuclear pore complex, which regulates what can get in and out of the nucleus, has an equivalent level of complexity. It has sensory function. It can identify things. It has a gating function that can restrict or allow access into the nucleus. So it's a highly complex machine, right? And just to get a little bit of an idea of the complexity, there are 30 individual proteins, or unique proteins, that make up a single nuclear pore, and over 1,000 proteins, 1,000 little molecular machines that make up a nuclear pore. And just for interest's sake, here's one protein, right? This is what a single protein looks like. It's a little molecular machine. Just think of it like an X-ray scanner. It can reach out into its environment, sense, identify, restrict, allow, okay? So we're starting to build an idea of the complexity of the cell. At the city level, you have tons of function, and at the individual level, the proteins are as complex as the machines that we use every day, as complex as your telephone, as complex as your car, as your refrigerator, right? So we'll cover one more. This is the power plant of the cell, right? Mitochondria, okay? And if you were to go to any power plant in the world, really, or the Crisp power plant over here down on the river, they function by a simple set of principles. And so what happens in a power plant is you have a pressure gradient, so in this case, steam. Steam then drives a turbine, and this turbine drives an electric motor, okay? So that electric motor then creates energy, okay? So the wildest thing happens in the power plant of the cell. There is a molecular motor that uses a pressure gradient, high pressure, low pressure. It turns a turbine, which then drives a molecular motor and stores energy. So let's look at this a little bit more in depth. So this is the cell's molecular motor in the power plant. This is called ATP synthase, okay? And if you know anything about electric motors in our world, there are some eerily similar aspects to the cell's motor and a electric motor. You have a stator. There's a stationary portion of the motor. There is a central axle or a central shaft. There are bearing surfaces that the motor rotates around, and there are even brushes that brush electrical charge to turn electrical charge into rotational motion, okay? And so here is a graphical representation of what the cell's electric motor looks like. So you have a pressure gradient rotating a turbine, which then drives a motor to then store energy. And once again, this protein is as complex, this system is as complex as a gas power plant. It's an incredible level of complexity. And this is too small for the human eye to see. There's different methods by which we can determine the structure of ATP synthase. But what we're seeing here is researchers have taken what's called an actin filament. Think of it like a hair out of your head. And they've connected that filament to the rotating part of this molecular motor. And then they can take a video and see that molecular motor rotating with the actin filament. So, we've talked about the cytoskeleton, we've talked about the nuclear pore complex, right, the TSA check gate, and then we've talked about the cell's motor. We're starting to understand the complexity of a single cell, right? So, there's our cytoskeleton, our nuclear pore complex, the TSA check gate, right, and our mitochondria. So, these are just a couple examples of the complexity in the cell. There are over 20,000 genes in the human genome, and each one of those make up a protein. Those proteins can be modified in multiple different ways, reaching in a single cell over millions of unique types of proteins. And then if you take one single cell, that single cell can have tens of billions of individual proteins in it. So whenever we think about the complexity of the cell, a city may not be the best analogy. It's actually as complex as the entire world economy, right? You've got about 7 billion people on this earth, shaking hands, interacting, having goals, aspirations, getting hurt, healing. Same thing happens in a single cell. You've got about 10 billion individual actors having goals, functions, aspirations, interacting with each other, getting damaged, getting repaired, right? So then, what does all this have to do with faith, you might ask? So for that, let's go to the orthology argument, all right? What does orthology mean? So if you take a yeast cell, baker's yeast that you can make sourdough bread with, right? If you take a yeast cell and compare it to a cell in your human body, you will find that there are orthologous, or orthology, there are orthologous structures. So the yeast cell, that single cell organism, it also has a nuclear pore complex, just like you do. There are some subtle differences, but it is obvious to see that it has a very similar structure and function. So that's what orthology means. Orthologous proteins are generally assumed to retain equivalent function in different organisms and to share key properties, right? So if we look at ATP synthase, our molecular motor of the cell, right? And if you look at the yeast ATP synthase, in this case, the human ATP synthase isn't well elucidated, so we use the bovine ATP synthase. If you compare the two, it's obvious to see they're both molecular motors. They operate by the same function. So they are orthologous, right? The cow and the single-cell yeast, right? And so this is true for the majority of the genes in yeast, that there are orthologous genes in humans. And actually, biomedical researchers, they study yeast to better understand humans. This is a well-accepted just fact of life. So what's the orthology argument? From a creationist worldview, I can look at this and say a common design, right? A common design between those molecular motors, between the cytoskeleton, between the 20,000 genes that are in humans. The common design would indicate that those two creatures have a common creator, right? And I think there's a lot of value to that argument. The evolutionary worldview would say that a common design, Freudian slip there, a common design would indicate a common ancestor, right? And if I'm alone in my room at night thinking, I can say that that's actually a pretty logical argument as well. And today, I don't want to have the orthology argument with you. For a moment, I want to take the evolutionary worldview at its word, and I want to talk about faith, okay? So if we're going to take this at its word for a moment, common design would indicate a common ancestor. We can go to the evolutionary tree of life, right? So, sorry, this is a little small. You've got your common ancestor down here, and this is what evolution proposes, right? And you've got yeast up here, the yeast cell that we've been talking about, that baker's yeast. And then humans are up here, cows are right next to it, right? And so the argument would say that they arose from a common ancestor somewhere down here, okay? Now, I'm not I don't know fossil evidence. I'm a molecular biologist. I know the cell. So I know there's arguments for and against creation in the fossil record. I'm not here to make that argument. But what is accepted in evolutionary circles is that the oldest fossils, the oldest remains of living tissue are sponges. Somewhere around 900 million years old is what they would propose. There's actually debate about that. It may be closer to 600 million. It's unknown, okay? So the oldest common ancestor is a sponge, okay? And so logically, we can assume if a yeast cell has all these very similar structures to a human cell, that common ancestor, the sponge, would also have those structures, right? And we can look at modern day sponges and see that modern day sponges also have these similar structures, right? So there is no evidence below this point, no physical evidence on this earth of what exists before this fossil sponge, right? So there is no fossil evidence for how the molecular complexity that we observe, that we've talked about today, could have arisen. All this complexity that we've talked about that is equivalent to the world economy, there is no evidence for how it arose. Now, pardon me here while I apply the Bible to this thought process. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. When I look at this is faith right here. Our world's theology says to trust what you can touch, what you can taste, what you can see, what you can observe, right? It's what we do in the scientific method. And evolutionary world circles would purport that they are based on fact and founded on a rock-solid surface. But the truth of the matter is that they are founded on faith. I know this from a molecular biology perspective beyond a shadow of a doubt in my mind. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. They're founded on faith. It's based on a dogmatic set of principles. I would posit to say that a belief in evolution is actually a religion. We, as Christians, we have a different belief in origins. 2 verses later in Hebrews 11:3, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were made of things which do appear. Through faith, we understand that this complexity arose. No one was here to see it, evolutionist or creationist. And all of this complexity, there is no physical evidence. And so we understand through faith. So today, as we begin to close, I want to give you a moment to pray in your own heart. For the person who walked in here and maybe believes that creation is a myth and adheres to evolution, if your faith in evolution has been shaken today, may you pray in your mind, give God a crack in the door of your heart. Say, God, you might be real. I might give you a chance. And see what he does in your life. See if he shows up. To the person in here who part of your heart loves Jesus and just wants to get him to know him more and more, and another part in your heart is at enmity against God. Or part of you believes in the creation account in the Bible, and then there's other times that you doubt in your mind. Pray to God, and it's my prayer that the part of us that loves God and believes his word grows, and the part that doubts shrinks. And to those of you who came in here with just firm and solid faith, absolute knowledge, may faith be added unto faith. And may your prayer be that we can take the good news of God's character, of a loving God who can create and recreate, who can recreate our hearts, who isn't a God of death, who doesn't use death as his engine of creation. May our prayer be that we can spread that good news to this dark and dying world around us, who understands death and lives in it every day, that we might have access to a new life. So take some time in your own mind to pray. Lord, I want to praise and honor you as creator and recreator, Lord. And today, Lord, grow our faith in you, and shrink our disbelief, Lord. Help us to fall deeper and deeper in love with Jesus, Lord, and the parts of us that are at enmity against Jesus, who are at war with God, Lord, help those shrink day by day. Turn us into images of your Son. We ask these things in your name. Amen.